Have you ever noticed how the word love is used so casually? We say, I love pizza, I love this song, I love that person. But beneath all those declarations, what do we really mean? For most of us, love begins with a spark, attraction, desire, or a feeling of being seen. It feels intoxicating, almost magical. Suddenly, the world seems brighter, our hearts beat faster, and life feels like it has purpose. But with time, something changes. The very love that once lifted us up starts to weigh us down. Expectations creep in. Fear of loss tightens its grip. Arguments replace laughter, and the sweetness turns into bitterness. Why does this happen? Because what we often call love is not love at all. It is attachment wearing the mask of love. It is desire dressed up as devotion. It is the fear of being alone disguised as affection. True love, as the Buddha and many wise teachers remind us, is something very different. It is not a bargain, not a chain, not a transaction of I give you this and you give me that. True love does not depend on conditions. It does not vanish when someone changes, grows older, or fails to meet our expectations. And yet, so many of us chase after the illusion. We hold on to the idea that someone must make us complete, that without them we are nothing. We mistake obsession for passion, jealousy for care, possession for commitment. But when love is tangled with attachment, it is destined to hurt. It is like holding a beautiful bird too tightly. In trying to keep it, we crush its wings. Imagine standing by the ocean. The waves come and go, never clinging to the shore, never asking for permission to return. Love, in its purest form, is like that, flowing, free, and vast. But the illusion of love turns the ocean into a cage, trying to trap each wave, terrified that it might escape. This is why relationships so often feel heavy, because what we seek is not truly to love, but to possess. We want someone to be ours, to meet our needs, to never change, to always stay. And when reality breaks those conditions, as it inevitably does, our hearts break with it. But deep down, we all long for something greater. We long for a love that does not suffocate, that does not demand, that does not vanish when things get difficult. A love that allows us to breathe freely, to grow, to be who we truly are. The Buddha once said that true love has 4 qualities: kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity. But before we can even touch those qualities, we must first see clearly how much of what we call love is only illusion. Think of a candle in a dark room. At first, its light feels like everything. But the moment a breeze blows it out, we realize how fragile it was. Conditional love is like that candle. It burns brightly for a time, but it depends on circumstances. Unconditional love is like the sun. It shines without asking, without bargaining, without fear of being extinguished. So the real question is not, do I love? But what kind of love am I practicing? Is it a love that binds and controls, or a love that liberates and uplifts? This journey we are beginning together is not about dismissing the beauty of human connection. It is about awakening to a deeper truth, that love is not something we demand or trade, but something we embody. Something that, when pure, flows endlessly, nourishing all it touches. And as we explore further, we will begin to see why the love most of us know brings so much suffering, and why the love the Buddha taught brings so much freedom. If we look honestly at our lives, we see that most of the love we have known is conditional. It is built on an unspoken contract. I will love you if you love me back. I will care for you if you never change. I will stay with you if you remain exactly as I want you to be. At first, these conditions are invisible. A couple falls in love, a parent embraces a child, a friendship begins. Everything feels effortless. But slowly, without realizing it, expectations appear like tiny cracks in glass. You should act this way. You should make me feel this. You should never disappoint me. And when those conditions are not met, the love we thought was so strong begins to fade. Conditional love is like a beautiful flower in a vase. It looks perfect, but it depends entirely on water, sunlight, and constant care. The moment those are missing, it withers. True love, by contrast, is like a tree with deep roots. It survives storms, seasons, and change. But most of us, without awareness, keep picking flowers and wondering why they die in our hands. This is why conditional love always carries hidden suffering. Where there is condition, there is fear. Fear of losing what we have, fear of change, fear of rejection. And fear breeds jealousy, anger, and pain. Think of someone who says, "I love you because you make me happy." It sounds sweet, but beneath the words is a trap. The day that person no longer makes us happy, does the love disappear? If so, was it ever love at all? The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering. When love is mixed with clinging, it becomes fragile and heavy. We cling to the idea of my partner, my child, my friend, forgetting that life itself is impermanent. People grow, change, and sometimes drift away. Conditional love cannot survive impermanence. That is why it hurts so much when things change, because we tied our happiness to a condition that was never meant to last. Imagine holding water in your hands. If you clutch it tightly, it slips through your fingers. The tighter you hold, the faster it escapes. But if you cup your hands gently, water rests easily within them. Love works the same way. Conditional love clutches. True love holds gently. This is not just philosophy, it is visible in daily life. Parents who expect their children to fulfill their unachieved dreams often suffer when the child chooses a different path. Lovers who expect their partner to remain young, attractive, or forever the same become bitter when time changes them. Friends who expect constant attention feel betrayed when life creates distance. All of this pain comes from one misunderstanding: believing that love is something we can control, something we can bargain with, something that must serve our desires. But love that demands is not love. It is a form of attachment disguised as affection. Conditional love says, "I love you if you do this." True love says, "I love you because you exist." When we begin to see this difference, something awakens in us. We start to notice how much of our suffering has come not from love itself, but from the conditions we attach to it. And this awareness leads us to an even deeper question. If conditional love brings suffering, what does unconditional love look like? What qualities allow love to be free, steady, and liberating instead of fragile and demanding? The Buddha gave us a profound answer: 4 immeasurable qualities of the heart. They are the foundation of love without conditions, the kind of love that does not wound but heals. If conditional love keeps us trapped in cycles of fear and disappointment, then how do we step into a love that is free? The Buddha gave us a map, a teaching so simple, yet so profound that it has guided seekers of truth for over 2,000 years. He called them the 4 immeasurables, or the 4 boundless qualities of the heart. These 4 qualities are not just ideas. They are states of being that can be cultivated, like seeds planted in the soil of our lives. With practice, they grow into trees whose shade can comfort everyone who comes near. And unlike the fragile flowers of conditional love, these trees do not wither when seasons change. The first quality is metta, or loving kindness. This is the sincere wish for others to be happy. It is not about romance, desire, or possession. It is the warmth in the heart that says, "May you be well, may you be safe, may you be free." Imagine looking at a stranger on the street and silently offering them this blessing. You don't know them, you don't expect anything back, but still, your heart expands. That is metta, love that gives without asking. The second is karuna, compassion. If metta is the wish for happiness, karuna is the response to suffering. When you see someone in pain and your heart cannot ignore it, that is compassion. Think of a mother who stays up all night with her sick child, or a friend who quietly listens when you are broken. Compassion does not mean pity. It is the deep recognition that, just like us, others suffer, and from that recognition arises the natural wish to help. The third is mudita, often translated as sympathetic joy. This one is rare, yet it is the medicine for jealousy. It is the ability to rejoice in the happiness of others. Imagine hearing that a friend achieved success. Conditional love might feel envy. Why not me? But mudita smiles and says, "I am happy because you are happy." It is a joy that multiplies joy, a love that celebrates rather than competes. And the fourth is upekkha, equanimity. At first it may sound cold, but it is not. Equanimity is the steady heart that does not cling, that remains calm in the face of life's ups and downs. It is the love that understands, you are free and so am I. It does not mean indifference. It means loving without attachment, without trying to control. It is the quiet strength that makes love stable, like a mountain untouched by storm. Together, these four immeasurable qualities are like four directions of love. Loving kindness warms, compassion heals, joy uplifts, and equanimity steadies. When they come together, love becomes unconditional. It is no longer fragile, no longer dependent on circumstances, no longer mixed with fear. But here's the beautiful truth. These qualities are already inside us. Every one of us has felt moments of kindness, flashes of compassion, glimpses of joy for others, or calm acceptance of change. The path is simply to water these seeds until they bloom fully in our lives. When we live with these four qualities, our relationships transform. We no longer say, I love you if instead we simply love. We no longer cling because we see that love is not possession but presence. We no longer fear change because love that is boundless cannot be taken away. And yet, as powerful as these teachings are, many people still struggle to live them. Why? Because the illusion of self, the belief in I, me, and mine, keeps twisting love into ownership. To truly understand unconditional love, we must look deeper into the nature of the self itself. If we look closely, we see that the greatest obstacle to unconditional love is not the other person. It is the illusion of self. This deep-rooted belief in I, me, and mine quietly shapes every thought, every relationship, every form of love we know. Think about the way we speak, my partner, my child, my friend, my love. At first, it sounds harmless, even natural, but hidden inside those words is a subtle claim of ownership. We don't just love, we cling. We don't just care, we possess. And once love becomes possession, it ceases to be free. The Buddha taught the truth of anatta, or non-self. This does not mean we do not exist. It means that what we call self is not fixed, not permanent, not truly ours. Just as a river is made of ever-changing water, we are made of ever-changing thoughts, feelings, and conditions. There is no solid I to hold on to, only a flow. So what happens when we bring this wisdom into love? Imagine holding someone you love in your arms. Without the illusion of self, you no longer think this person belongs to me. They are mine. Instead, you see them as a free being walking their own path just as you are walking yours. You do not try to trap them in the cage of your expectations. You simply stand beside them, honoring their freedom and offering your love without chains. This kind of love is radical. It is not about me or mine at all. It is about seeing and understanding. It is about realizing that love cannot be true if it demands ownership. Think of the sky. It does not say these clouds are mine. It simply holds them, letting them pass freely. Love rooted in non-self is like that sky, vast, open, embracing, but never clinging. And here is the paradox. When we let go of possession, love actually becomes deeper, because only then is it free from fear. If your love depends on someone being yours, then every moment you will live in the shadow of losing them. But if your love is free, you can cherish them fully in each moment, without anxiety, without control. This is why the Buddha said that true love gives freedom to oneself and freedom to the other. A love that imprisons is not love, it is attachment. A love that liberates is the love that touches the truth of non-self. But embracing this truth is not easy. The illusion of self is strong. The habit of possession runs deep. That is why, even when we understand these teachings, the heart still trembles when faced with change and loss. To truly love without self, we must also confront another reality the Buddha revealed, the truth of impermanence. One of the deepest truths the Buddha revealed is impermanence. Everything changes. Every breath, every thought, every season of life, nothing remains the same. Yet when it comes to love, we often resist this truth more than anywhere else. We want the person we love to stay the same forever, the same smile, the same warmth, the same devotion. We cling to the memory of how things were and hope they never fade. But love, when tied to permanence, becomes fragile, because life itself is never permanent. Think of the first time you fell in love. That electric rush, that feeling of floating. It seemed eternal in the moment, didn't it? And yet time moved on. People changed, circumstances shifted, and the story transformed. Sometimes the love grew deeper, sometimes it withered away. Either way, change was inevitable. Impermanence is not a punishment, it is the nature of life. Flowers bloom and flowers fade. Children grow and parents age. Friendships sparkle and then drift apart. When we cling to the idea that love must never change, we set ourselves up for heartbreak. But here's the beauty. When we accept impermanence, love becomes more precious, not less. A flower is beautiful because it will not last. A sunset moves us because we know it will soon disappear. In the same way, love becomes radiant when we understand its fleeting nature. Every smile, every embrace, every shared moment is a gift, not a guarantee. The Buddha taught that suffering comes not from change itself, but from our refusal to accept change. When we expect love to be frozen in time, we suffer. But when we embrace impermanence, we open our hearts to love fully without fear. Imagine holding the hand of someone you cherish, knowing deeply that one day you will have to let go. Instead of sadness, such awareness can awaken gratitude. Each moment together becomes a jewel, each word a treasure, each silence a prayer. Love and impermanence are not enemies, they are companions. Impermanence teaches us to love more deeply, more sincerely, because we know that nothing lasts forever. It whispers, do not wait to show your kindness. Do not delay your compassion. Do not waste today clinging to illusions of tomorrow. And this realization leads us to another truth. If love is to be real, it must give freedom. It cannot trap, it cannot bind, it cannot demand eternity. Love that respects impermanence becomes love that liberates both ourselves and those we hold dear. Because true love does not say, stay with me forever. True love says, wherever life takes you, may you be free, may you be happy, may you be at peace. And this is where the journey of love begins to transform completely. Once we embrace impermanence, we see that love is not about control, not about holding on, but about allowing freedom. And freedom, in the deepest sense, is the very essence of true love. When most people hear the word freedom, they think of independence, of living life without restrictions. But in love, freedom takes on a deeper meaning. True love is not about tying someone to us. It is not about shaping them into what we want. True love is about giving space, the freedom to grow, to change, to simply be. Think for a moment about the way love is often portrayed in songs and movies. You are mine. I can't live without you. I will never let you go. It sounds romantic, but beneath those words lies a quiet prison. When we cling too tightly, our love suffocates the very person we claim to cherish. The Buddha taught that love without freedom is not love at all, it is attachment. And attachment breeds fear, jealousy, and control. But love that carries freedom allows both hearts to breathe. It whispers, I do not own you, I walk beside you. Imagine sunlight. It shines on flowers without demanding how they should bloom. It does not say, you must grow taller, you must face this direction, you must never change. The sun simply gives warmth, and in that warmth, flowers blossom naturally. True love is like sunlight, it nurtures without controlling. When we bring freedom into love, something beautiful happens. Resentment dissolves, fear lessens. The relationship becomes a space of growth instead of confinement. Because love is not about holding someone down, it is about lifting them up. This kind of love transforms how we see ourselves as well. We stop measuring our worth by whether someone stays or leaves. We realize that love, when pure, cannot be lost. Even if circumstances change, the love we gave continues to live inside us, shaping who we are. But this does not mean freedom is careless or detached. Freedom does not mean indifference. True love cares deeply, but it cares without chains. It supports without suffocating. It says, I see you. I honor your path. I am here, but I will not bind you. Think of the stories of the Buddha's great compassion. He did not love only those who followed him. His love extended to strangers, to enemies, to all beings. Why? Because his love was not about ownership. It was about freedom. His love flowed like a river, nourishing everything it touched, yet never clinging to a single rock along the way. And here lies the heart of it. Love that is free is love that is fearless. When we no longer cling, we no longer fear loss. When we no longer demand, we no longer feel betrayed. We love fully in each moment, knowing that love itself is not something that can be taken away. But how do we bring this into daily life? How do we transform the way we love from clinging to freeing, from demanding to understanding? That is where practice comes in. Meditation, mindfulness, and compassion are not just spiritual exercises. They are tools that teach us how to love with freedom every single day. And so, the question becomes, how do we practice unconditional love in the middle of our busy, complicated, imperfect lives? It is one thing to talk about unconditional love in theory. It is another to live it in the middle of ordinary life, when bills need paying, when children are crying, when relationships are tested by misunderstanding and stress. The question is, how do we practice this love here and now? The Buddha's answer was clear. We must train the heart just as we train the body. Love without conditions does not appear overnight. It is cultivated through mindfulness, patience, and compassion moment by moment, breath by breath. Let's begin with mindfulness. Each time we pause and notice our thoughts, we discover how often our love is mixed with expectation. We think, if only they acted differently, if only they spoke more gently, if only they gave me more attention. These thoughts seem harmless, but they are the roots of conditional love. With mindfulness, we see them clearly. And the moment we see them, we can choose to let them go. Next is compassion practice. When we remember that every person we meet is carrying invisible struggles, our hearts soften. The parent who loses their patience, the friend who grows distant, the partner who disappoints us, they too are fighting battles we cannot see. Compassion reminds us that love is not about demanding perfection, but about walking together in our shared humanity. Another practice is joy in others' happiness. Imagine your friend succeeds in something you always wished for. Instead of envy, what if your heart celebrated with them? This shift changes everything. It transforms love from competition into connection. Each person's joy becomes your joy. In this way, love multiplies endlessly. And then there is equanimity, the steady balance that keeps love from becoming possessive. When we love with equanimity, we do not cling to the idea that things must stay the same. We do not try to control what cannot be controlled. Instead, we allow love to breathe. This does not mean we feel less, it means we feel more deeply, but with wisdom. Practicing unconditional love also happens in the smallest acts. Listening fully without interrupting. Offering kindness without expecting gratitude. Giving time, attention, or forgiveness, even when it feels hard. Every act becomes a seed, and with enough seeds, the garden of love grows naturally. But here is the most important part. Unconditional love begins with ourselves. Many people try to love others while harshly criticizing themselves. But if your own heart is full of judgment, how can it pour out kindness? To love others unconditionally, we must first learn to sit with our own flaws, our own imperfections, and say, I am worthy of love even as I grow, even as I stumble. Daily life gives us endless chances to practice. A driver cuts us off on the road. We can meet it with anger or with patience. A family member speaks harshly. We can react with bitterness or respond with understanding. Every moment is an invitation. Will we choose conditional love or unconditional love? This is not easy, of course. We will fail again and again. But each time we return to the practice, the heart expands a little more. Over time, what once felt impossible to love without condition becomes natural, like breathing. And as this love takes root in daily life, it becomes something larger than ourselves. It begins to ripple outward, touching not only family and friends, but strangers, even those we once considered enemies. This is how love transforms the world, not through grand declarations, but through small, steady acts of unconditional care. And when we seek inspiration for how far this love can go, we need only turn to the life of the Buddha himself. A life filled with boundless compassion that embraced even those who tried to harm him. Stories carry truths in a way that lectures never can. A single tale told with sincerity can slip past the walls of the mind and land softly in the heart. The Buddha knew this, and throughout his life, he shared not only teachings, but stories of compassion that continue to echo across centuries. One such story tells of Angulimala, a feared bandit whose very name spread terror. He had taken many lives, and the people lived in constant fear of his cruelty. When the Buddha heard of him, he did not avoid the danger. Instead, he walked calmly into the forest where Angulimala hunted. The bandit saw the Buddha's figure from afar and rushed forward, weapon raised. But no matter how fast he ran, he could not reach the Buddha. Breathless, he shouted, "Stop, monk! Why don't you stop?" The Buddha turned, his gaze steady and compassionate, and replied, "I have stopped, Angulimala. I have stopped causing harm to living beings. It is you who has not stopped." Those words pierced deeper than any weapon. In that instant, Angulimala's heart cracked open. He threw down his sword and fell to the ground, transformed by compassion that saw beyond his violence to the human soul within. From that day forward, he renounced harm and lived as a monk under the Buddha's guidance. This story reminds us, unconditional love does not turn away from darkness. It shines its light directly into it. Even the cruelest person carries the seed of transformation, waiting for compassion to awaken it. Another story is that of the wounded swan. As a boy, Prince Siddhartha once saw a swan fall to the ground, pierced by an arrow. His cousin Devadatta rushed forward, claiming the bird as his since he had shot it. But Siddhartha held the trembling creature close and said, "The swan belongs not to the one who seeks to kill it, but to the one who seeks to save it." The king, when asked to judge, sided with Siddhartha. The swan was freed, cared for, and returned to the sky. Even in childhood, the seed of compassion guided the Buddha's heart. His love extended not only to humans, but to every living being. And there is the story of the hungry tigress. In one of his past lives, the Bodhisattva encountered a tigress so starved she could no longer feed her cubs. Instead of turning away, he looked upon her suffering with boundless compassion. In an act beyond measure, he offered his very body to save her and her young. This tale, though ancient, carries a timeless message. True love is not afraid of sacrifice. It asks, "What can I give?" instead of "What can I gain?" Through these stories, we see a pattern. Compassion is not passive. It is not simply feeling sorry. Compassion acts. It steps into danger to stop suffering. It shields the weak. It chooses sacrifice when necessary. And in every case, compassion is rooted not in judgment, but in understanding. When we hear these stories, something stirs inside us. A quiet voice whispers, "This is what it means to love without condition. This is what it means to see beyond the surface of things." And if we ask, how do we live this compassion in our own world with its traffic jams, deadlines, and disagreements? The answer is that the practice begins small. Every smile, every moment of patience, every hand extended to someone in need is its own story of compassion. We may not face bandits in the forest or starving tigers, but each day brings us countless chances to choose love over fear, understanding over judgment. The Buddha's stories live on, not because they happened long ago, but because they happen again and again through us. Each of us is writing our own chapter in the great book of compassion. And when we live in this way, something extraordinary happens. Compassion frees not only those we touch, but also ourselves. For the one who loves without condition is the one who knows true freedom. True love is not just a feeling we hold inside. It is a force, a current that transforms everything it touches. It reshapes relationships, it softens hardened hearts, it dissolves fear, and it rewrites the way we see the world. Think of a candle in a dark room. One small flame has the power to chase away the shadows. True love works in the same way. Even a single act of unconditional care can change the entire atmosphere around us. Consider the story of a child who grows up never hearing words of kindness, only criticism and anger. That child may grow into an adult carrying wounds invisible to the eye. But imagine the moment they encounter someone who loves without conditions, a teacher, a friend, a partner. That steady presence, that unwavering acceptance, begins to heal what years of pain have written into their heart. One flame of love and the darkness begins to lift. This is the transformative power of true love. It liberates. It frees us from the prisons we build, prisons of resentment, of fear, of loneliness. And the miracle is this: the freedom is shared. When you love without demand, not only does the other person feel released, but so do you. Many people believe power lies in control, in bending others to our will. But the Buddha taught a greater power, the ability to love without clinging. This kind of love transforms because it does not bind, it opens. It does not suffocate, it gives space to breathe. In daily life, this transformation can be subtle. A gentle word that diffuses anger before it erupts. A patient silence that allows another to feel truly heard. A forgiveness that ends the cycle of revenge. Each of these small choices shifts the course of a life, sometimes more than we realize. On a larger scale, unconditional love has the power to change entire communities. History shows us that when leaders, saints, and ordinary people alike choose compassion over hatred, nations begin to heal. Wars lose their fuel. Divisions soften. Humanity remembers its shared heart. But perhaps the most profound transformation happens within ourselves. When we love without condition, something in us dissolves, the endless craving for approval, the fear of being abandoned, the pride that separates us from others. Slowly, we discover that love was never about possession, but about presence. Not about clinging, but about offering. And this discovery is liberating. In Buddhism, this transformation is described as the opening of the heart, the awakening of Bodhisattva, the mind of enlightenment born from compassion. It is said that when this flame is lit within us, every thought, every word, every action begins to lean toward healing. We no longer live only for ourselves, but for the well-being of all beings. True love is not weak. It is the strongest force in existence. It has carried mothers through sleepless nights, monks through decades of practice, and entire movements toward peace. And though it asks us to let go of ego, what it gives in return is far greater, a life lived fully, deeply, and freely. The transformation is real. You can feel it in your own body. Think of the last time you forgave someone, truly forgave them. Remember the lightness in your chest. Or the last time you received unconditional kindness, how it melted your defenses, how it made you want to offer the same to others. This is love at work, reshaping us from the inside out. And so, when we speak of true love, we are not speaking of something abstract, distant, or impossible. We are speaking of a power already present within you, waiting to be practiced, waiting to be shared. The question that remains is this: what happens when we carry this love all the way, beyond even this life, beyond the boundaries of time and space? That is where the final chapter will take us, into the vast horizon of unconditional love, where nothing is lost and everything is embraced. We began this journey searching for love, the kind that does not fade, the kind that does not chain, the kind that does not wound. Along the way, we discovered that true love is not a possession, not a bargain, not a fleeting passion. It is a boundless presence, a spacious embrace, an open heart that asks nothing in return. But here lies the final truth. Love itself is not the end. It is the gateway. Beyond love lies liberation. The Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering. When we cling to wealth, it slips through our fingers. When we cling to youth, it fades. When we cling to people, even those we love most, time eventually separates us. And yet, when we learn to love without clinging, something extraordinary happens. We discover freedom. Unconditional love is not just about kindness to others. It is about dissolving the illusion of a separate self. It is the realization that your joy is my joy, your pain is my pain, your life is my life. And when the boundaries blur, what remains is not just love, it is liberation from the prison of I and mine. This is why the Buddha's compassion was infinite. He saw no difference between himself and the world. To love without condition was to live without walls, to breathe in harmony with all that exists. And in that vast openness, liberation blooms. Think of it this way. Love is the river. Liberation is the ocean. The river flows, nourishing, carrying, healing. But ultimately, it seeks the ocean, that vast, endless expanse where all rivers meet, where no boundary remains. When we practice unconditional love in daily life, we are walking the path of the river. Every act of kindness, every moment of patience, every breath of compassion carries us closer to the ocean of freedom. And when the river finally dissolves into the sea, what is left? Not loss, not emptiness, but boundless peace. So the path is not about abandoning love. It is about letting love lead us beyond itself into the freedom where love and wisdom become one. This is the heart of the Dharma. This is the path to liberation. And so, as we close this journey together, remember this: true love is not a dream nor a rare gift for a chosen few. It is already within you, waiting to be lived, waiting to be shared. Every breath, every step, every choice is a chance to embody it. Love freely, love deeply, love without fear, and let that love guide you, like a river to the ocean, into the boundless horizon of liberation. This is the power of unconditional love. This is the path beyond love. This is the way to freedom. And if these words have touched something within you, if this journey into true love and liberation has opened even a small window in your heart, then consider walking with us further. This space, Zen Buddhism Wisdom, is where we continue to explore the timeless teachings of the Buddha, not as distant philosophy, but as living guidance for daily life. If this resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe, to share, and to be part of this circle of wisdom and compassion. Each video is like another step on the path, a step we can take together. May you carry these reflections into your life. May your heart grow lighter, your love deeper, your freedom wider. And may we meet again here in the shared silence and clarity of the Dharma.